we have paid lip service to our defence since the end of the Cold War, and it's only in the last couple of years that, well, really since Putin invaded Ukraine, and people suddenly realised that actually there is a threat to Europe. And I think the former head of MI6, Alex Younger, over the weekend has said actually that the threat of Putin to Europe and to the UK is very much higher than a lot of people perhaps consider it to be. So there is a wake-up call, I think, and the potential that Britain and France, with other members of Europe, are going to have to provide peace enforcement forces in Ukraine, again, is very much focusing people's attention. And the other key element is the Americans. It seems pretty clear that President Trump is looking at Europe differently, and we can no longer rely on the Americans to be our sort of military backstop, as it were. So there is a strategic review of Britain's defence going on at the moment, and that should report fairly soon. And I think given the threat of Putin at the moment, yes, Britain's defence forces are very light. And if the threat of Putin continues, then Britain, along with all the other European countries, need to stiffen our defence. And that will probably mean having larger armies, more equipment, and may well require more people into the army. And if there are not enough volunteers or reservists, then, ultimately the government might have to think about conscription. It's an interesting prospect. Certainly the Swedish conscription process that they do certainly can generate a lot of people, the way Sweden does it. And they had conscription for a long time, then suspended it and brought in the current system in 2017, I think. And the other Scandinavian countries, Norway and Finland, also have a conscription, compulsory conscription, because they recognise that the threats to them are more than their standing army. Now, when it comes to numbers, the good thing about the Swedish system is basically the military choose exactly who they want. So every 18-year-old in Sweden has to register and fill in forms saying, their background, their training, their qualification, their fitness, health, etc., etc. And then the Swedish government decide who they need. So it's flexible, as in the numbers can go up and down. They can get the right sort of people. But it also allows what we call conscientious objectors, in other words, those who don't want to hold a gun or fight, to join anyway and do other roles without having weapons. So, potentially in the UK, given how many young people there are, 18-year-olds, there is, it's a very large supply of potential soldiers. So when a lot of discussion at the moment about what sort of system we might need, the Swedish one is pretty good, and the conscripts are paid reasonably well and are trained and then ready to be used if required. I mean, I think that the Norwegian system might be more interesting to young people in this country, because one of the elements of the Norwegian system, again, it is selective, but the Norwegians select the best young men and women, and in return for that, they have their university fees paid for example. And I know my children who have finished university now, that would have been something very compelling. So Swedish would work, but all the Scandinavian systems are pretty good and pretty robust, I think. It seems to work in Sweden, and it suits them, and a similar system works in Finland. I think we first of all probably need to decide whether conscription is the right thing in Britain. I personally believe that before we look at conscription, we need to look at our reserves that we have anyway, because we have well over 100,000 reserves. When you served in the military, as I did, served in the army, you then have a reserve liability for many years afterwards. Now, this hasn't, the Ministry of Defence hasn't have to call up reserves, but in theory, it can do. And there are a lot of active reserves. I'm an active reserve, so I still do some military service, and that's voluntary, but others can partake. So before we look at conscription, I think we should use our reserves much better, because at the end of the day, these are trained young men and women, well, not necessarily young, but the trained men and women who could be mobilized much more easily. But when it comes to objectors, there are always been conscientious objectors, and they've been dealt with. And I think it very much depends on what situation you're in. You know, in the Second World War, for instance, when we were absolutely desperate for every man and woman to fight, some conscientious objectors who refused to fight were punished in some form, whether it be jail or put on arduous duties. Now, we're not at that at the moment, absolutely not. And there must be a system to allow those people who don't want to fight to not fight and potentially do other things. I think with the Swedish system, it seems to work well, that if you really don't want to fight, then there are lots of jobs that you can do in support of the government that don't necessarily lead to fighting. But I think it's a fairly small minority. I know that there's a lot of talk in this country at the moment that Gen Z and the woke generation just won't fight. I don't really hold that. Certainly all the young people I know, they might not want to fight. In fact, none of us want to fight. I've been on the battlefield of the world for 37 years, and I know that it's horrific and you want to avoid it if at all possible. But when we look at the history of this country, when the call has gone out in the Second World War, the First World War, and even before that, the young men and women of this country have always stepped forward, you know, and the vast majority will do that. So those who don't want to, I think, will still be a very small percentage.